Aitah for wanting to get my grandmother medical care. My grandmother Ginny, female, 71, was diagnosed with stage 4 lung cancer in November 2024. She had pre-existing chronic obstructive pulmonary disease and other heart issues. She alternated between staying with my mother Franny, female, 47, my Aunt Roxy, female, 50, and my other Aunt Liz, female, 37. In December, when she was transferred from Liz's house to Roxy's, she had to be taken to the hospital by Roxy and her daughter Isabel, female, 24, because of the flu, where she remained for a week, including her 71st birthday and Christmas. During her stay, we learned that a mass in her lung was extending into her ribcage. I, female, 20, traveled from out of state and spent the majority of her hospital stay with her, quitting my job in the process to alleviate the burden on Roxy and my other Aunt Jamie, female, 52, who was alternating between spending nights and working. Once she was discharged, she returned to stay with Roxy and shifted between there and visiting my mom. On one of my visits to my mother's, I promised my grandmother I would come back the following Sunday to see her. I left that Friday to go home and returned on Sunday. When I arrived at my mother's, my grandmother was nowhere to be found, and I was informed that she had gone home with her husband Conrad, male, 85, and Liz, with whom they were residing. That same evening, I received a text from Jamie stating that Conrad and Liz were not allowing anyone to see or speak to my grandmother and were withholding her pain medication, having called the police on Roxy and Isabel and threatening to do the same to anyone else who attempted to visit her. I then called Conrad, who explained that anyone could see her but needed to make an appointment first. I persuaded him to let me visit her 2 days later. I informed everyone else of his response, and they all attempted appointments but were ignored. 2 days passed, and I went to Liz's house, where I was stopped at the door by Conrad, who lectured me before allowing me inside. Liz escorted me to a room at the back of the house where my grandmother was. She turned on the light, and it was evident that she was being neglected. There were no bed sheets, no pillowcase, and a blanket was on the floor next to her bed. A walker was positioned to cause her to fall if she tried to get up. When I attempted to speak with her, there were obvious signs of dehydration, and Liz informed me that they were refusing her any real food, opting instead for a protein shake that everyone knew she disliked and would not consume. A horn was placed next to her to signal if she needed anything, but Liz told me it was non-functional and she would bang on the walls instead. I was permitted to speak to her as much as possible while Liz and Conrad came in and out, but after about 10 minutes, Liz instructed me to let her sleep. I sat in the living room after that, and Liz waited for me to leave before going to pick up her children from school. As the week dragged on, Jamie and Roxy made welfare check calls until one night, Isabel, Roxy's oldest daughter Annie, female, 30, and I were at Jamie's. She had printed out text messages, copies of elder abuse laws, and photos of my grandmother before and during her time in Liz's care. Eventually, she made a final welfare check call requesting police, fire, and emergency medical services. The officer who arrived reviewed the documents, listened to our concerns, and subsequently informed us that they had cleared her, finding only 2 of her pain pills in the bottle, which had been changed before their arrival. The following day, around 1 p.m., my mother received a call from Conrad stating that Ginny had been taken to the hospital between 1:30 and 2 o'clock that morning and was finally admitted at 5 o'clock. When we went to see her, there was a note on a board that simply read, "Mom, you're fine, Liz." As the mothers, Roxy and Jamie, moved in and out, my mother had not arrived yet. Isabel and I discussed the situation, prompting Jamie to enter and inform us that Conrad had called my mother to say he would put a stop to our discussions about what had been happening, with Liz in the background threatening a restraining order. The next day was Saturday, and everyone except Conrad and Liz went to the hospital to visit. Conrad then texted to say he wanted Sunday to himself for his time with his wife. It is worth mentioning that Conrad is very religious and spends his Saturdays at church, refusing to engage in any activities. Thus, we gave him that Sunday. The following week, there was constant back and forth communication between the mothers and Liz. They put my grandmother on a pureed diet, and when that reached Liz, she visited the hospital and started yelling at everyone because she insisted that my grandmother needed to receive her nutrition through Enrollment 4. To provide some background on my grandmother, she was Italian and loved to eat. None of us recall a time when she wasn't baking or cooking. Ziti, meatballs as large as your fists, brownies, pickles, stew, you name it, and chances are she created it. Therefore, her lack of food was out of the question, especially since everyone brought some form of meal with them during their visits. Subs, soups, stews, chicken, fries, whatever she requested. During this period, Roxy, Jammy, and I were seeking a way to transfer power of attorney from Liz to one of her other sisters. Eventually, after much discussion, even though we tried to keep her unaware to avoid stressing her out, we informed her how Conrad and Liz had attempted to isolate her from all of us. She was understandably upset with Liz and wanted her removed from her power of attorney. Fortunately, a nurse provided us with the number of a notary willing to assist us, and we scheduled an appointment for the following day. When the notary arrived, we managed to finalize everything, after which a doctor entered and informed us that her cancer had spread to her lymph nodes and the entirety of her right lung, which was beginning to fill with fluid and shut down. He also mentioned that he was uncertain how much time she had left and suggested we discuss hospice and options for the future. My grandmother was coherent and seemed to accept this news. She inquired about her remaining time, and when we said we weren't sure, she stated that as long as she was with her family, she was okay. It was undoubtedly a very emotional day for everyone involved. Liz called to report Roxy for over-medicating my grandmother, so Isabel and I had to retrieve the medications from Roxy that they had not provided to Liz. Since Liz had anticipated having my grandmother back the next day, she had only given her 2 pills that they had shown the police. Normal visits resumed, but I began to argue more frequently with my family. My oldest aunt Addie, female, 58, had been relaying information to Liz, and I was adamant that my grandmother needed her medication. After the whole food incident, Liz stopped coming to the hospital, and despite Conrad's actions, my grandmother continued to call for him, only to be hurried off the phone and disregarded. Eventually, my grandmother fell into a coma-like state that lasted for 3 days. During those days, she received visits from her daughters, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren. On the final day, my mother left early after arguing with Roxy and Jammy about the nurses removing the Roman IV drip, as her body was no longer tolerating the liquids and was simply swelling, refusing to return. Isabel and I waited downstairs in the waiting room, accompanied by Annie's youngest daughter, Anna, female too, while Addie and her children were outside in the parking lot taking pictures on her son Rick's male, 32 motorcycle. Roxy was texting Isabel, but since Anna had fallen asleep, she sent me upstairs, where 2 nurses were with Roxy and Jackie. My grandmother had passed away. When everyone was informed, Addie began to cry, questioning why we hadn't told her. She had arrived immediately after I did, and it was time to make final decisions and funeral arrangements. Liz refused to provide any of the insurance information necessary for her to be buried as she wished, so we opted for cremation, as even with pooled resources, we could not afford a burial. The mothers were disputing how everything transpired and are currently having minimal contact. Eventually, Roxy received a call indicating that an autopsy might be necessary for my grandmother since Liz had disclosed that she had been overmedicated. We have yet to receive any updates. Shortly thereafter, Jammy texted to inform us that the cremation papers had been signed and that we just needed to wait. Eventually, we received a text stating that Liz and Conrad had taken my grandmother's ashes. Liz had already called the hospital upset that my grandmother was released to Jammy, and later got another message that a funeral would be held the next day with no details about the location. We found out the time and place just hours before the funeral. At the funeral home, Liz was absent, and Conrad sat in the back discussing family drama and my aunt's divorce as we stared at a random, possibly empty urn. Following this, we proceeded in a funeral procession to a nearby base. Conrad is a veteran, where he led a sermon about religion before we were given approximately 10 minutes to look at a closed casket containing her ashes. So no one received any part of her, and she didn't even get to be buried alongside her mother, also cremated, as she had wished. I am still in conflict with my mother, who insists that everyone was at fault and that we all disrespected my grandmother, blaming Roxy and Jammy for her death by taking away her fluids. Whenever I attempt to explain the situation to her, she dismisses my perspective, asserting that I lack understanding because I am only 20. Am I the asshole? Story 2. I had to fight to get my grandmother medical care, to no avail. My grandmother Ginny, female, 71, was diagnosed with stage 4 lung cancer in November 2024. She had pre-existing chronic obstructive pulmonary disease and various heart problems. She alternated living with my mother Franny, female, 47, my Aunt Roxy, female, 50, and my other Aunt Liz, female, approximately 37. In December, after being transported from Liz's house to Roxy's, she required hospitalization due to the flu, where she remained for a week, including her 71st birthday and Christmas. During her hospital stay, we discovered that a mass in her lung was protruding and affecting her ribcage. I, female, 20, traveled from out of state and stayed with her for most of that duration, even quitting my job to alleviate the burden on Roxy and my other Aunt Jammy, female, 52, who had been shifting between nighttime duties and working. Once she was discharged, my grandmother went home with Roxy and moved between staying there and visiting my mother. On one visit to my mother's house, I informed my grandmother that I would return the following Sunday to see her. I left that Friday, but upon my return, I was informed that she had gone home with her husband Conrad, male, 85, and Liz, with whom they were residing. Later that evening, I received a message from Jammy indicating that Conrad and Liz were preventing anyone from visiting my grandmother and were withholding her pain medications. They even threatened to involve the police against Roxy and Isabel, while also warning anyone else who attempted to visit. I subsequently contacted Conrad, who claimed that anyone could visit her but needed to schedule an appointment first. I convinced him to allow me to visit her 2 days later. I notified the others, but they were largely ignored. 2 days later, I arrived at Liz's house and was stopped at the door by Conrad, who gave me a lecture before letting me in. Liz escorted me to a room at the back of the house where my grandmother was located. It was evident that she was being neglected. There were no bed sheets or pillowcases, just a blanket on the floor and a walker dangerously positioned that could cause her to fall if she tried to get up. When I attempted to speak with her, it was clear she was dehydrated. Liz then informed me that they were denying her any real food, opting instead for a protein shake that she had consistently refused to drink. While a horn was near my grandmother for her to call for assistance, Liz claimed it didn't work, and she had to bang on the walls for help. I was granted some time to talk with her as Liz and Conrad moved in and out, but after about 10 minutes, Liz told me to allow her to rest. I stayed in the living room while Liz waited for me to leave before heading to pick up her kids from school. As the painful week progressed, Jammy and Roxy continued to make welfare check calls. One night, I, Isabel, Roxy, and Roxy's eldest daughter Annie, female, 30, gathered at Jammy's, where she had printed out messages, copies of elder abuse laws, and photos of my grandmother both prior to and during her time in Liz's care. Jammy ultimately made the final welfare check call, requesting police, fire, and emergency medical services. The officer arrived, examined the documents, listened to our concerns, and later informed us that they found my grandmother with only 2 pain pills in her bottle and had made a change before their arrival. The following day, around 1:00 p.m., my mother received a call from Conrad stating that Ginny had been taken to the hospital at around 1:32 a.m. that morning and was finally admitted at 5:00. When we arrived to see her, there was a note on a board stating, "Mom, you're fine, Liz." While the mothers Roxy and Jammy were going in and out, my mother had not yet arrived. Isabel and I discussed what had been happening, prompting Jammy to come in and inform us that Conrad had told my mother he would stop us from discussing the situation, with Liz in the background threatening to obtain a restraining order. The next day, a Saturday, everyone except Conrad and Liz visited the hospital, and finally, Conrad texted saying he wanted Sunday to himself to spend time with his wife. It's worth noting that Conrad is very religious and spends all day Saturday at church, refusing to engage in any other activities. So we allowed him that Sunday. The following week was filled with ongoing disputes between the mothers and Liz. They placed my grandmother on a pureed diet, and when Liz went to the hospital, she began yelling at the staff because she wanted my grandmother to receive nutrition through Enrollment 4. A bit of background on my grandmother: she was Italian and had a passion for cooking and baking. None of us can recall a time when she wasn't preparing wonderful meals, from ziti and oversized meatballs to brownies and stews. Therefore, not providing her with food was unacceptable, especially since everyone brought her various foods when they visited, including subs, soups, stews, chicken, and fries, catering to her requests. Throughout this period, Roxy, Jamie, and I had been searching for a way to transfer power of attorney from Liz to one of the other sisters. After considerable discussions, we eventually informed my grandmother, keeping it from her earlier to reduce her stress, about how Conrad and Liz were trying to isolate her from us. She became upset with Liz and wanted her removed as her power of attorney. Fortunately, a nurse provided us with the contact information of a notary willing to assist, and we arranged an appointment for the following day. When the notary arrived, we completed the necessary paperwork, and shortly thereafter, the doctor informed us that my grandmother's cancer had spread to her lymph nodes and her entire right lung, which was beginning to fill with fluid and cease functioning altogether. He also mentioned uncertainty regarding how much time she had left, suggesting we start discussing hospice options. Surprisingly, my grandmother seemed to accept this idea, asking how long she had. When we expressed our uncertainty, she said that as long as she was with her family, she was okay. As anticipated, it was a highly emotional day for everyone concerned. Liz called and accused Roxy of over-medicating my grandmother. Therefore, Isabel and I had to retrieve the medications from Roxy, which they hadn't given to Liz. Since Liz expected my grandmother to return home the next day, she had only provided Liz with the 2 pills they had shown to the police. Visits continued, and I began arguing more with my family. My oldest aunt Addie, female, 58, was informing Liz about everything happening, and I was adamant about my grandmother receiving her medications. After the food incident, Liz didn't come to the hospital, and despite Conrad's actions, my grandmother kept asking for him and attempted to call him, only to be hurried off the phone and dismissed. Eventually, my grandmother fell into a coma-like state that lasted for 3 days. During these 3 days, she had her daughters, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren come to see and talk to her. On the final day, my mother left early after a dispute with Roxy and Jamie regarding the nurse's decision to remove the Roman IV drip, as my grandmother's body was no longer accepting fluids and was simply swelling. Isabel and I were in the waiting room with Annie's youngest daughter, Anna, female, too, while Addie and her children were outside in the parking lot taking pictures on her son Rick's, male, 32, motorcycle. Roxy had been texting Isabel, but since Anna had fallen asleep, she sent me up to the room where 2 nurses were present with Roxy and Jackie. I discovered that my grandmother had passed away. When the news spread, Addie began crying and asking why we hadn't informed her. She had entered the room right after me, as we faced the need to make final decisions and funeral arrangements. Liz refused to provide any insurance information for my grandmother to be buried as she wished, leading us to opt for cremation since we couldn't gather enough funds for a burial. The mothers argued about how events transpired and currently have little to no communication. Eventually, Roxy received a call indicating they might have to perform an autopsy on my grandmother since Liz claimed she was overmedicated. As of now, we have yet to receive any updates. Not long after, Jamie texted to inform us that the paperwork for cremation had been signed and all we had to do was wait. Eventually, we received a message stating that Liz and Conrad had taken my grandmother's ashes. Liz had already called the hospital, upset about my grandmother being released to Jamie, and we subsequently received another message announcing a funeral for the next day with no details. We learned the time and location just hours before the service. At the funeral home, Liz was absent, while Conrad sat in the back discussing family drama and my aunt's divorce, as we stared at an empty urn that may have contained nothing. We then formed a line for our funeral procession to a nearby base. Conrad was in the army, where he held a religious sermon before granting us a mere 10 minutes to gaze at a closed casket containing her ashes. Ultimately, no one received a part of her, and she was not buried alongside her mother, who was also cremated, as she had desired. I continue to argue with my mother, who insists that everyone acted wrongly and that we disrespected my grandmother, claiming that Roxy and Jamie were responsible for her passing due to withholding her fluids. Whenever I try to explain my perspective, she dismisses me, insisting that I lack understanding because I am only 20. Am I the one in the wrong? Story 3. My 18M girlfriend, 19F, thinks my professor's brief farewell hug was cheating. My professor, whom I hold in high esteem, was leaving our college. During her farewell, she embraced several students, myself included, a brief, formal hug. Instinctively, I stepped back, feeling uncomfortable since I was not raised with that custom. Later, I shared my feelings with my girlfriend, conveying my unease about the situation. However, she became upset, ceased communication with me, and eventually accused me of cheating. She recalled past instances where she felt I was too close to other girls, including a sister figure I had to cut off for her. Now, I feel emotionally exhausted, bewildered, and uncertain about how to proceed. Recently, one of my professors, likely in her late 20s or early 30s, was leaving our college. I had been her student for 6 months and had developed great respect for her. She introduced me to philosophy, for which I will always be grateful, and we often engaged in discussions about Marxism during class. She also contributed to improving my speaking abilities during examinations. Overall, she was one of the finest educators I have ever encountered and stated that I am among her favorite students. At her farewell, attended by approximately 50 of my classmates, both male and female, she took photos with everyone. I refrained from asking for an individual picture because I genuinely respect her too much for that. After the photographs, she asked me, "Adamia, shall we go get some food for your classmates?" I agreed, and we got into her car. During the drive, she inquired about my parents and my future aspirations. I answered respectfully, sitting quietly in the front passenger seat with my hands on my knees. She also mentioned that she was leaving the college to get married, something she had announced earlier, but I had missed. She shared stories about her fiancé while we drove. Upon arriving at the shop, we purchased some food, and she casually offered me a dakla. We shared one while she continued talking about her fiancé, and frankly, I began to feel rather bored. Regardless, we gathered the food, returned, and served it to our classmates. Then came the emotional moment. She started crying when one of my classmates presented her with a beautifully crafted, handwritten letter, complete with a coffee-stained effect and charred edges. As she became emotional, she began embracing all the girls one by one. Here is the issue. I stepped back because that was not something I was accustomed to or had ever experienced. I had not recognized this tradition of hugging professors, especially since my expression of respect differs. Once the emotional moment passed, I approached her, touched her feet, and said, "Thank you, ma'am." She expressed her appreciation, and I thanked her once more. Afterward, she resumed hugging another girl, and I turned to leave. Just as I had taken 2 steps away, she unexpectedly called my name. Before I could completely turn around, she stepped forward and gave me one of those formal hugs. Instinctively, I took a couple of steps back, breaking the embrace. I cannot say for sure if she noticed, but she simply said, "Thank you for organizing this and goodbye." That was the end of it. However, I felt strange afterward, almost repulsed. It felt more natural to touch her feet, and that was what seemed right to me. This hugging was not appropriate. It dawned on me later that the only reason I felt this way was that I had never been introduced to such a practice before, and frankly, I never will be accustomed to it. Additionally, I was not even the first male she embraced that evening. Later that night, I recounted the experience to my long-distance girlfriend, 19 years old, and we have been together for nearly a year. I detailed how the entire incident felt wrong to me. And just to clarify, I am not conservative. I simply have never encountered this before, okay? My apologies. After sharing my feelings, she abruptly ended the call, offering a flimsy excuse, and then refused to stay on the line with me, which is unusual. The following morning, she completely ignored me, ghosting me for the entire day. Despite my repeated inquiries about what was bothering her, literally pleading for her to tell me, she remained silent. After hours of pushing, I finally realized that her change in behavior started after our conversation the previous night. She became distant, rude, and kept saying, "You're annoying me." That was her sole reason. Subsequently, she began blocking me, turning off her phone, and avoiding communication. Unable to understand her reaction, I resorted to doing sit-ups and drafting her a lengthy message about how much I cared for her. When she eventually replied, she simply stated, "I love you," for a brief moment before reverting to, "Your voice irritates me." Then, just 15 minutes ago, After even more pleading and near tears, she finally confessed. "It's amusing how you didn't see a problem with that." I was baffled. I explained to her that I did have an issue with it, that it repulsed me, that it hurt me, and that I even articulated my feelings in detail the night before. But she just insisted, "No, you didn't." I maintained that I did express my discomfort, but she abruptly hung up again. She claimed she had to go celebrate her roommate's birthday or something, promising she would return soon. Just before leaving, she used the term cheating to describe my actions. Now I feel incredibly unsettled. She even began mentioning previous instances of my alleged cheating. For example, once, I sent 10 voice messages to a girl I regarded as a sister, not biologically related, but we shared a sibling-like bond. She even called me Bhaiya, which means brother in Hindi. She was quite upset after receiving poor results in the 12th grade and not being admitted to any colleges, so I was merely trying to support her. However, my girlfriend told me this was inappropriate, that I couldn't have these so-called sisters. She asserted, "Men's intentions are always questionable," which, to be fair, is a perspective she holds because every guy who has been her brother eventually confessed feelings for her. She insisted that such relationships were unacceptable and that they made her uncomfortable. It took me 2 to 3 days of pleading and crying for her to forgive me. I vowed never to do it again. I even completely cut off contact with that girl. She attempted to reach out through different channels to find out what happened, but I never responded. To clarify, this was someone I genuinely considered family. I had introduced her to my girlfriend at the beginning of our relationship. She even sent me a rakai, a traditional bracelet or string that a sister ties on her brother's wrist. What frustrates me is that my girlfriend still has a so-called brother. He sends her social media reels and other things. When I pointed this out, she merely stated, "He doesn't send me 10 voice messages or anything. He's not as close to me as you were to her." So this is my current situation. Just sitting here, feeling lost. And yes, I know myself well enough I will probably go and beg her again, apologizing for something I don't even comprehend. I even reminded her that she was my professor and that I couldn't simply reject her. My girlfriend responded, "I knew you would use that excuse, which is why I didn't mention this before. I was attempting to resolve this insecurity on my own." At this point, I'm just emotionally drained. Consider this my rant, a plea for advice or whatever you wish. I have shared everything candidly. What are your thoughts? Story 4. My 29F best friend, 31F, stole from me. How should I feel? We have been close friends for nearly 2 decades. Throughout these years, I have observed that she possesses a tendency to be somewhat selfish, exploitative. It is challenging to articulate. She has numerous admirable qualities and serves as a positive influence in my life. I understand that what I am about to share may sound negative, yet it truly is the only significant character flaw she exhibits. Until now, I have managed to overlook it. During the past 20 years, I have come to realize that I must be cautious regarding how much I invest in our friendship because, irrespective of my efforts, she feels no inclination to reciprocate unless it serves her interests. Essentially, she is the sort of person who will consistently permit someone else to cover the expenses without ever offering to contribute herself. Consequently, you should only be willing to pay for things if you are entirely comfortable doing so, understanding that she would never do the same for you. For this reason, I am careful to invest in our friendship in a manner that does not leave me feeling exploited when she fails to reciprocate. In our younger days, we would often go out together, and she would invariably arrange circumstances that resulted in me being stuck with the bill. We would reach the register, or the bill would arrive, and she would always have an excuse ready. She would claim to have forgotten her wallet, insist she had no cash but would repay me next paycheck, or simply declare, "We'll use your card and I'll pay you back later." She never did repay me. On one occasion, we reached the register, and she placed all her items down and said, "I forgot something, let me go grab it." Well, she went to retrieve the item and walked out of the store without paying. From the car, she sent me a message that read, "Hurry up and pay, I'm waiting in the car." There was a long line, and I had quite a few items, which embarrassed me since I was sure the cashier had witnessed her theft. I eventually succumbed to the pressure and paid. When I finally got to the car, she promised to reimburse me but never did. Once I started insisting on separate checks, more firmly than I felt comfortable. she refused to go anywhere with me. Whenever I suggested going out, she would say, "Only if you are covering the cost." This issue extends beyond finances. Approximately 6 or 7 years ago, she requested my help to prepare for a small gathering. I agreed. However, my assistance turned into my doing all the cooking, which took 6 hours, while she watched television. The small gathering turned out to be a massive party, which terrifies me, filled with people I had never met. I began drinking before the guests arrived, so I could not drive myself home. Her boyfriend, who is now her husband, saw me crying outside, away from everyone, and remarked, "Oh, she told me you would freak out when you saw how many people were coming." I still assist her in cooking for gatherings, but I now ensure I remain sober so that I can drive home if too many people show up. My help has also changed. I prepare several dishes at home and simply place them in the oven and slow cooker at her residence. This is a favor I am willing to provide. At this stage, it has been nearly 8 years since we have done anything out together. Now, whenever we meet, we mostly sit at either her or my house, playing games on the Nintendo Switch or watching movies and television shows. I am perfectly fine with this. It is rather enjoyable. When we meet at my home, I always ensure that there is food, drinks, and snacks available. If she is coming for lunch and dinner, I make sure to prepare both meals. When we gather at her house, I must either bring food or go hungry. She will eat in front of me without offering me anything, so I almost always bring my own food. She never expresses gratitude. While this behavior is undeniably peculiar, it does not truly trouble me. I do not mind bringing a casserole when we spend time at her home. I mention it only because it is one of the few current examples of her willingness to take without any desire to reciprocate. There are few present-day examples, because I have implemented numerous measures to avoid finding myself in situations where I would be left with the bill or taken advantage of. If this were anyone else, I might just assume that they do not actually care for me. However, she behaves this way with all her other friends and even her husband. I have noticed that he also takes steps to prevent being exploited. A couple of months ago, she upgraded her Kindle, resulting in her owning 2. She asked me if she could log into my account on her old Kindle to access my library. I consented. I knew she had a tendency to exploit others when the opportunity arose, yet I never believed she would actually steal from me. About a month ago, I received an email from Amazon notifying me of a Kindle purchase. I called and asked her if she had bought the book. She seemed taken aback and said, "Oh, I accidentally purchased it. I was going to reimburse you, but I didn't have your Venmo information." I know for a fact she had my Venmo details. Unsurprisingly, she never reimbursed me. This week, a similar situation occurred. She offered the same excuse and again, she never paid me back. Clearly, I will change my password and disable her device. However, I am uncertain how to feel about this situation. The total she spent on the 2 books is approximately $40. I am not the type of person who would end a 20-year friendship over $40. Yet, the fact that she purchased something, hoping I would not notice, and then failed to reimburse me has left a bitter taste in my mouth. I genuinely believed she was a better person than this. For context, we have always been in similar financial situations. She is neither wealthy nor impoverished. She could afford to buy these books. Financially, I am in the same position as her, and she is aware of this. In summary, my best friend used my card without my knowledge to make purchases, hoping I would not notice, and this has soured my perception of our entire friendship. I used to be able to overlook this shortcoming, but now that she has stolen from me, it feels as though I can no longer ignore it.